The autumn rain hammered against the towering windows of Ravencrest Palace, each droplet seeming to echo through the vast corridors like whispered secrets. Princess Evangeline stood motionless in the grand gallery, her emerald eyes fixed upon the portrait of her grandmother, Queen Isabella, whose painted gaze seemed to follow her every movement. The late afternoon light, filtering through the storm clouds, cast eerie shadows across the oil paintings that lined the walls, each one depicting generations of Ravencrest royalty who had ruled the kingdom of Aldermore with iron fists and golden crowns. At 23, Evangeline possessed a beauty that poets wrote about and artists desperately tried to capture. Her auburn hair cascaded in gentle waves past her shoulders, and her porcelain skin held the faintest hint of rose in her cheeks. But it was her eyes that truly set her apart from her royal ancestors. They burned with an intelligence and determination that made even the most seasoned courtiers uncomfortable. Unlike her predecessors, who had been content to wave from balconies and attend charity galas, Evangeline questioned everything, challenged traditions, and refused to simply exist as a decorative figure in the palace's grand theater. The sound of approaching footsteps on the marble floor broke her concentration. She turned to see Lady Margaret Thornfield, her personal secretary and closest confidant, hurrying toward her with an expression of barely contained urgency. Margaret was a woman of 45, with sharp features and steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She had served the royal family for over 2 decades and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of palace protocol that made her indispensable to the monarchy. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said, her voice breathless from her brisk walk through the palace corridors, "I've been searching everywhere for you. The preparation meeting for tomorrow's state dinner has been moved up by an hour. The ambassador from Valeria has arrived early, and your father wishes to brief you on the diplomatic protocols before the evening's festivities." Evangeline sighed, her gaze drifting back to her grandmother's portrait. "Tell me, Margaret, do you remember Queen Isabella personally? You've been here long enough to have served during her reign." Margaret's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained rigid. "I was but a junior secretary then, Your Highness, barely involved in the inner workings of the court. But, yes, I remember her. She was formidable, a woman who commanded respect through presence alone." "And the moonstone pendant?" Evangeline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember her wearing it?" The change in Margaret's demeanor was immediate and striking. Her face paled, and she glanced nervously around the empty gallery, as if expecting to find eavesdroppers lurking behind the marble pillars. "Your Highness, that is not a topic for casual discussion. The pendant, it has been sealed away for good reason." Evangeline turned fully to face her secretary, studying the older woman's reaction with keen interest. Throughout her life, any mention of the moonstone pendant, the legendary piece of jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother, had been met with similar responses. Hushed tones, nervous glances, and immediate attempts to change the subject. It was as if the entire palace operated under some unspoken agreement to pretend the pendant didn't exist. The pendant itself was the stuff of legends within the royal family. Passed down through generations of Ravencrest queens, it was said to be carved from a single moonstone the size of a dove's egg, surrounded by diamonds that captured and reflected light in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Queen Isabella had worn it to every major state function, every royal ceremony, and every public appearance until her sudden death 25 years ago. Since then, it had been locked away in the royal treasury, forbidden to be worn by any member of the family. "Margaret," Evangeline said, stepping closer to her secretary, "I've been thinking about this for months. Tomorrow marks the 25th anniversary of Grandmother's death. The state dinner is being held in her honor. Wouldn't it be appropriate, even expected, for me to wear her most famous piece of jewelry?" Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her leather portfolio against her chest. "Your Highness, you must understand that the decision to seal away the pendant was made by your father, with the full support of the Privy Council. There are complications surrounding that piece of jewelry that go beyond mere sentiment or tradition. What kind of complications? Evangeline pressed, her voice taking on the commanding tone she had inherited from her royal lineage. I'm not a child anymore, Margaret. I'm heir to the throne of Aldermore. Don't I have a right to know the truth about my own family's history? Before Margaret could respond, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the gallery swung open with a resonant crash that echoed through the vast space. King Marcus Ravencrest strode into the room, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone present. At 58, he was still an imposing figure, standing well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that hadn't yet begun to bow under the weight of his crown. His dark hair, now liberally streaked with silver, was impeccably styled, and his steel-blue eyes held the weight of 2 decades of absolute rule. He wore the formal military dress uniform of the Aldermore Royal Guard, complete with gold braiding and ceremonial medals that caught the light with each purposeful step. But it was the expression on his face that caused both women to straighten their postures and fall silent, a mixture of paternal concern and royal authority that had become his signature look whenever dealing with palace matters that threatened to disrupt the carefully maintained order of their world. Evangeline, he said, his deep voice carrying easily across the expansive gallery, Lady Thornfield, I trust you're both prepared for tomorrow evening's dinner? The ambassador from Valeria has brought news that will require delicate handling, and I need to know that every detail of the evening will proceed without incident. Evangeline exchanged a quick glance with Margaret before stepping forward to greet her father. Despite their occasional disagreements about royal protocol and her role in the kingdom, she held deep respect for Marcus and the burdens he carried as king. She had watched him navigate political crises, economic challenges, and international disputes with a wisdom that came from years of experience and an unshakable commitment to their people's welfare. Of course, father, she replied, performing a slight curtsy that acknowledged his position while maintaining her own dignity. Margaret and I were just discussing the final preparations, though I did have a question about the ceremonial aspects of the evening. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression becoming more guarded. What sort of question? Evangeline took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would likely provoke exactly the kind of reaction she had grown accustomed to whenever she challenged palace traditions. Given that tomorrow marks the 25th anniversary of grandmother's death, and considering that the state dinner is being held in her memory, I believe it would be appropriate for me to wear the moonstone pendant. It would send a powerful message about our family's continuity and honor her legacy in the most meaningful way possible. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Margaret seemed to have stopped breathing altogether, while Marcus's expression transformed from mild interest to something approaching alarm. The storm outside chose that moment to unleash a particularly violent gust of wind, causing the windows to rattle in their frames and adding an ominous undertone to the already tense atmosphere. Absolutely not, Marcus said, his voice carrying the finality of a royal decree. That pendant remains sealed for reasons that go beyond your understanding, Evangeline. This is not a matter for discussion or debate. But Evangeline had inherited more than just her grandmother's beauty and intelligence. She had also inherited the Ravencrest stubbornness that had helped their family maintain power for over 3 centuries. With all due respect, father, I believe it is very much a matter for discussion. I am 23 years old, heir to the throne, and yet I'm being treated like a child who cannot be trusted with her own family's artifacts. What are these mysterious reasons that supposedly put the pendant beyond my understanding? Marcus stepped closer, his imposing presence filling the space between them. Because, my dear daughter, some secrets exist to protect rather than to hide. The Moonstone pendant is connected to events that preceded your birth, events that have the potential to destabilize not just our family, but the entire kingdom. Your grandmother's death was not the simple heart failure that was announced to the public. The admission hung in the air like a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads. Margaret gasped audibly, clearly surprised that the king had revealed even this much information. Evangeline felt her heart racing as the implications of her father's words began to sink in. All her life, she had been told that Queen Isabella had died peacefully in her sleep, succumbing to a heart condition that had troubled her for years. The official story had been consistent, verified by court physicians, and accepted without question by the kingdom and the international community. "What are you saying?" Evangeline whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm raging outside. Marcus looked away for a moment, his gaze moving to the portrait of his mother that had started this entire conversation. When he looked back at his daughter, there was something in his eyes that she had never seen before, a vulnerability that revealed the weight of secrets he had carried alone for far too long. "I'm saying that your grandmother's death was complicated. The moonstone pendant was somehow involved in the circumstances surrounding her passing. The decision to seal it away wasn't made out of sentiment or tradition. It was made out of necessity. There are forces connected to that piece of jewelry that go beyond anything you can imagine, Evangeline. Forces that we cannot control and cannot afford to unleash." Evangeline stared at her father, processing this information that completely overturned everything she thought she knew about her family's history. "Forces? What kind of forces?" "Father, you're speaking in riddles and expecting me to simply accept your authority without explanation. If I'm truly going to inherit the crown someday, don't I deserve to know what I'm inheriting?" The king was quiet for several long moments, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with the burden of knowledge that had shaped his reign for over 2 decades. "The moonstone pendant is more than just jewelry, Evangeline. It's connected to abilities that have run through our bloodline for generations. Abilities that your grandmother possessed, and that I believe may have passed to you." "Abilities?" Evangeline repeated, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had suddenly become uncertain. "The women of our line have always been more than they appeared," Marcus continued, his words coming slowly as if each one was being carefully weighed before being spoken. "Your grandmother could see things, know things that she shouldn't have been able to know. The pendant seemed to amplify these gifts, but it also attracted attention from those who would use such power for their own purposes." The revelation hit Evangeline like a physical blow. Throughout her life, she had experienced moments of inexplicable intuition, knowing when courtiers were lying to her, sensing danger before it manifested, understanding the true motivations behind diplomatic negotiations that puzzled even seasoned advisors. She had always attributed these insights to intelligence and good instincts, never imagining they might be something more supernatural in nature. "The night your grandmother died," Marcus continued, "the pendant began to glow with an inner light that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. When she passed, the light went out, and we discovered that anyone who touched the pendant afterward experienced visions. Disturbing visions of possible futures, alternate presents, and hidden truths that no one should have to bear. We had to make the decision to seal it away before it could cause more damage." Margaret had remained silent throughout this exchange, but now she stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Your Highness, perhaps this is enough revelation for one day. The dinner preparations still require attention, and there will be time to discuss these matters more fully after tomorrow's ceremonies have concluded." But Evangeline was not ready to let the conversation end. The pieces of a puzzle that had confused her for years were finally beginning to fit together, and she was determined to understand the complete picture. "Father, if what you're saying is true, then I need to know everything. These abilities you're describing, these visions, I've experienced things throughout my life that I've never been able to explain. Perhaps it's time I understood what I'm really capable of." Marcus's expression became even more grave. "That's exactly what I was afraid you would say. Evangeline, the power that runs through our bloodline is not a gift. It's a curse. It attracts dark forces that seek to corrupt and control it. Your grandmother spent the last years of her life fighting against influences that tried to use her abilities for purposes that would have destroyed our kingdom. I will not allow you to face the same fate." "But don't you understand?" Evangeline argued, her voice rising with passion and frustration. By keeping these secret from me, by treating me like I'm too fragile or too naive to handle the truth, you're actually making me more vulnerable. If these abilities exist within me, if this power is part of my heritage, then I need to understand it and learn to control it. Hiding from it won't make it go away. The storm outside seemed to be reaching its peak, with thunder rumbling overhead and rain lashing against the windows with increasing intensity. The dramatic weather perfectly matched the emotional tempest that was building within the gallery as three people wrestled with secrets that had shaped their lives for decades. Marcus walked to the window, staring out at the turbulent sky while clearly struggling with the most difficult decision of his reign. There's more, Evangeline. Things that I had hoped never to tell you. The Moonstone pendant doesn't just amplify abilities. It also serves as a beacon to others who possess similar gifts. When your grandmother wore it, it attracted the attention of a secret society that has existed in the shadows of European nobility for centuries. They call themselves the Order of the Crimson Dawn, and they seek to gather those with supernatural abilities under their control. Evangeline felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the storm outside. A secret society? Father, this sounds like something from a Gothic novel. I wish it were fiction, Marcus replied, turning back to face her. But the Order is very real, and they have members throughout the courts of Europe. They infiltrate royal families, government organizations, and religious institutions, always seeking those who possess the kind of power that our bloodline carries. Your grandmother refused to join them, and her resistance ultimately led to her death. The weight of this revelation settled over Evangeline like a heavy cloak. Her grandmother hadn't died of natural causes. She had been murdered by people who wanted to control her supernatural abilities. The pendant that she had always seen as a beautiful piece of family jewelry was actually a dangerous artifact that had cost Queen Isabella her life. They killed her, Evangeline said, her voice hollow with shock and growing anger. These Order people kill my grandmother because she wouldn't let them use her abilities. We believe so, Marcus confirmed, though we could never prove it definitively. The court physicians found no evidence of poison or violence, but your grandmother had been receiving increasingly threatening messages in the weeks before her death. Messages that made it clear the Order would not tolerate her continued refusal to cooperate with their plans. Margaret stepped forward again, her face pale, but her voice steady. Your Highness, this is why the pendant must remain sealed. Wearing it would send a signal to the Order that the power of the Ravencrest bloodline is active again. It would put not just you, but the entire royal family and kingdom at risk. Evangeline walked slowly to her grandmother's portrait, studying the painted features that so closely resembled her own. In the portrait, Queen Isabella wore the Moonstone pendant, its painted surface seeming to catch light even in the dim afternoon glow filtering through the storm clouds. For the first time, Evangeline noticed something she had missed in countless previous examinations of the painting. Her grandmother's eyes held a hint of sadness, as if she were carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear alone. I understand now why you've kept these secrets, Evangeline said finally, her voice quiet but determined. But I also understand that hiding from this legacy won't protect any of us indefinitely. If this Order still exists, if they're still seeking people with these abilities, then they already know about me. They're probably watching and waiting for signs that the power has manifested in the next generation. Marcus nodded grimly, which is exactly why the pendant must remain sealed. As long as it stays locked away, there's hope that they'll believe the bloodline power died with your grandmother. But Evangeline was thinking beyond her father's protective instincts to the larger implications of what she had learned. If she truly possessed supernatural abilities, if this power was part of her heritage and destiny, then perhaps the answer wasn't to hide from it, but to embrace it responsibly. Her grandmother had tried to resist the Order alone, but maybe a different approach was needed. Father, she said, turning back to face him with a resolve that reminded him powerfully of his late mother. What if we're approaching this all wrong? What if instead of hiding from this legacy, we used it to protect our kingdom? If the Order is still active, still seeking to control people like us, then maybe it's time someone stood up to them with the full power of a royal bloodline behind them. The suggestion clearly terrified Marcus. Evangeline, you don't understand what you're proposing. The Order isn't just a collection of ambitious nobles playing a conspiracy. They have resources, connections, and abilities that span across multiple countries. They've toppled governments, assassinated leaders, and manipulated the course of European politics for over 2 centuries. You cannot fight them alone. Who says I would be alone? Evangeline countered. We rule a kingdom, Father. We have allies, resources, and the loyalty of millions of people. If we used those advantages in combination with whatever abilities our bloodline possesses, we might be the first family to successfully resist the Order's influence. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the gallery doors. A palace guard in formal livery entered and bowed deeply before addressing the king. Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but Lord Chancellor Blackwood has requested an urgent audience. He says it concerns intelligence about tomorrow's state dinner that cannot wait. Marcus exchanged a meaningful glance with Margaret, who immediately understood the significance of the timing. Lord Chancellor Blackwood was the head of the kingdom's intelligence services, a man who rarely requested urgent audiences unless genuine threats to royal security had been detected. Very well, Marcus said, his voice resuming the formal tone of royal authority. Tell the Lord Chancellor I'll meet him in the royal study immediately. He turned back to Evangeline, his expression serious but no longer entirely dismissive of her arguments. This conversation is far from over, my daughter. But for now, we have immediate concerns that require attention. Promise me you won't do anything regarding the pendant until we've had time to discuss this matter more thoroughly. Evangeline studied her father's face, recognizing the genuine concern and love beneath his royal authority. She also recognized that he was asking for her promise as a daughter, not commanding obedience as a king. The distinction was important to both of them. I promise I won't act precipitously, she said carefully, choosing her words with the precision that came from a lifetime of diplomatic training. But I also want your promise that we will discuss this matter fully, with all the details and truths that I deserve to know as your heir. Marcus smiled for the first time since entering the gallery, an expression that transformed his stern features into something warmer and more paternal. You have my word, Evangeline, though I suspect that when you learn the full truth, you may wish I had continued to shield you from it. As the king left to meet with Lord Chancellor Blackwood, Evangeline remained in the gallery with Margaret, both women processing the dramatic revelations that had just reshaped their understanding of the royal family's hidden history. The storm outside was beginning to subside, but the emotional and psychological tempest unleashed by the truth about the moonstone pendant was just beginning to build. Your Highness, Margaret said softly, her formal demeanor slipping slightly to reveal genuine affection and concern, I hope you understand that everything your father has told you comes from a place of love. He has carried these burdens alone for so many years, always hoping to protect you from the dangers that claimed your grandmother. Evangeline nodded, walking slowly through the gallery as she processed everything she had learned. I do understand, Margaret, but I also understand that protection and preparation are not the same thing. If I'm truly destined to inherit these abilities along with the crown, then I need to be ready to face whatever challenges they might bring. As they made their way through the palace corridors toward the royal apartments, neither woman could have imagined that their conversation was being monitored by sophisticated listening devices planted throughout the building by agents of the very organization they had been discussing. The Order of the Crimson Dawn had been waiting 25 years for confirmation that the Ravencrest bloodline power had passed to the next generation, and Evangeline's words had just provided exactly the evidence they needed to reactivate their long-dormant plans for the Kingdom of Aldermore. The royal treasury of Ravencrest Palace existed in the palace's deepest level, 3 stories beneath the main foundation, accessible only through a series of increasingly secure checkpoints that had been designed by the kingdom's finest security experts. The walls were carved from solid granite, reinforced with steel plates that could withstand explosions, and protected by both modern electronic security systems and ancient enchantments that few people in the modern world understood or even believe existed. Evangeline stood before the massive vault door at 3 o'clock in the morning, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation that made her feel more alive than she had in years. She wore a simple black dress and soft-soled shoes that allowed her to move silently through the palace corridors, and her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical braid that wouldn't interfere with her clandestine mission. The decision to venture into the treasury had not been made lightly. Following her conversation with her father and the subsequent meeting with Lord Chancellor Blackwood, Evangeline had spent hours researching everything she could find about her grandmother's death and the mysterious circumstances surrounding the Moonstone pendant. The palace library contained detailed records of Queen Isabella's final weeks, including medical reports, security briefings, and diplomatic correspondence that painted a picture far more complex and dangerous than the official narrative. What she had discovered had only strengthened her resolve to understand her heritage fully. The medical reports contained inconsistencies that suggested the court physicians had been instructed to obscure certain details about the Queen's condition. The security briefings mentioned unusual visitors and unexplained phenomena in the weeks leading up to Isabella's death. Most significantly, the diplomatic correspondence revealed that several European royal families had experienced similar mysterious deaths among their members with supernatural abilities during the same time period. The evidence pointed to a coordinated campaign by the Order of the Crimson Dawn to eliminate those who refused to cooperate with their agenda. But it also suggested that Queen Isabella had been working on something, a way to protect future generations of her bloodline from the fate that had befallen so many others with similar gifts. Evangeline approached the biometric scanner that guarded the treasury's outer door, placing her palm against the cool metal surface. The device hummed softly as it analyzed her genetic markers, royal bloodline authorization codes that had been programmed into the palace security systems since her birth. After several tense seconds, the scanner beeped once, and the massive door began to swing open with a whisper of perfectly calibrated hydraulics. The treasury beyond was a marvel of both ancient craftsmanship and modern technology. Display cases lined the walls, each one containing priceless artifacts that represented centuries of Raven Crest history. Crown jewels glittered under carefully controlled lighting. Ancient weapons bore the weight of legendary battles, and documents sealed in climate-controlled glass cases preserved treaties that had shaped the political landscape of Europe for generations. But Evangeline's attention was focused entirely on the far end of the chamber, where a single display case stood isolated from the others, surrounded by its own circle of protective lighting and covered with a black silk cloth that had remained undisturbed for 25 years. The Moonstone pendant waited beneath that cloth, holding secrets that would either empower her to protect her kingdom or destroy everything she held dear. As she approached the covered case, Evangeline became aware of a strange, tingling sensation in her fingertips, as if the pendant were calling to her across the intervening distance. The feeling grew stronger with each step, until her entire body seemed to be vibrating in harmony with some invisible energy source. She had experienced similar sensations throughout her life during moments of intense intuition or emotional stress, but never with this level of intensity or clarity. The protective case was secured with multiple locks, each requiring different authorization codes that had been changed regularly since the pendant's sealing. But as Evangeline's hand approached the first lock, something extraordinary happened. The mechanisms began to disengage automatically, as if responding to her presence rather than requiring deliberate input. One by one, the security systems that had protected the pendant for decades recognized her as their intended user and granted access without resistance. With trembling fingers, Evangeline lifted the black silk cloth and gazed upon the Moonstone pendant for the first time in her life. The photographs in the royal archives had not done justice to its breathtaking beauty. The central moonstone was indeed the size of a dove's egg, its surface seeming to contain swirling galaxies of silver light that moved and danced in patterns too complex for the human eye to fully process. The surrounding diamonds had been cut in a style that was both ancient and timeless, each facet designed to capture and amplify the moonstone's natural luminescence. But it was the pendant's immediate reaction to her presence that truly took her breath away. As soon as her eyes made contact with the moonstone's surface, the entire piece began to glow with a soft, silver light that pulsed in perfect synchronization with her heartbeat. The illumination grew steadily brighter, casting dancing shadows on the treasury walls and filling the chamber with an otherworldly beauty that seemed to belong to dreams rather than reality. Evangeline reached toward the pendant with hands that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. The moment her fingers made contact with the moonstone's surface, the world around her exploded into a kaleidoscope of visions, memories, and sensations that threatened to overwhelm her consciousness entirely. She found herself standing in the same treasury, but the chamber was filled with the ghostly figures of her royal ancestors. She could see Queen Isabella as a young woman, wearing the pendant for the first time and experiencing the same overwhelming rush of power and responsibility. She witnessed other queens from earlier generations, each one learning to harness the supernatural abilities that came with their bloodline while fighting against forces that sought to corrupt or control them. But the visions went beyond mere historical recreation. Evangeline saw possible futures stretching out before her like branching pathways through time. In some of these futures, she embraced her heritage and used her abilities to protect her kingdom from threats both natural and supernatural. In others, she allowed fear to drive her into hiding, only to watch as the Order of the Crimson Dawn gradually infiltrated and corrupted everything she held dear. Most disturbing were the visions that showed her what would happen if she tried to ignore her heritage entirely. The supernatural forces that had been held in check by her grandmother's resistance would eventually find other outlets, manifesting through weaker individuals who could be more easily controlled and manipulated. The resulting chaos would spread across Europe, toppling governments and plunging entire nations into conflicts that had supernatural origins but conventional consequences. The pendant also shared knowledge that had been accumulated by generations of Ravencrest women. She learned about the Order of the Crimson Dawn's true structure and capabilities, understanding for the first time that they were not merely ambitious nobles, but the descendants of ancient bloodlines that had once openly ruled through supernatural means. Their modern secrecy was a strategic adaptation to a world that no longer believed in magic, but their power and influence remained as strong as ever. More importantly, she learned about the resistance network that Queen Isabella had spent her final years establishing. Hidden throughout Europe were other royal families, noble houses, and powerful individuals who possessed supernatural abilities and were secretly working to oppose the Order's agenda. They had been waiting for 25 years for a sign that the Ravencrest bloodline was ready to resume its leadership role in this shadow war. As the visions continued to flow through her consciousness, Evangeline began to understand the true weight of her inheritance. The Moonstone pendant was not merely a piece of jewelry or even a supernatural artifact. It was a key to a hidden world that existed parallel to the conventional political and social structures of modern Europe. By putting it on, she would be declaring herself ready to assume her grandmother's role as a leader in the fight against forces that threatened not just her kingdom, but the fundamental balance between supernatural and natural forces in the world. The decision to lift the pendant from its case and place it around her neck was made not from impulse, but from a deep understanding of necessity. As the chains settled against her throat and the moonstone came to rest against her chest, Evangeline felt a transformation begin that went beyond anything she could have imagined. Her senses expanded exponentially, allowing her to perceive layers of reality that had been invisible to her before. She could feel the presence of every person in the palace, understand their emotional states, and sense their intentions with crystal clarity. More significantly, she became aware of foreign presences within the palace. Individuals whose thoughts and intentions were shielded by training and supernatural protection, but who could not completely hide their alien nature from her enhanced perception. The Order of the Crimson Dawn had agents among the servants, guards, and even guests who had been positioned to monitor the royal family and report on any signs of supernatural activity. The pendant also connected her to the broader network of resistance that her grandmother had established. Across Europe, she could sense other individuals with similar abilities stirring to life as they became aware that the Ravencrest bloodline had awakened. Messages began flowing through channels that existed outside normal communication methods, as allies who had been dormant for decades prepared to resume their ancient struggle against the Order's influence. But with this expanded awareness came an immediate understanding of the danger she had just placed herself and her family in. By activating the pendant, she had sent a signal that could not be hidden or disguised. Every member of the Order with sufficient sensitivity would know within hours that the power they had worked so hard to suppress had returned to active status. The carefully maintained peace that had protected Aldermore for 25 years was about to come to an abrupt and violent end. Evangeline made her way back through the palace corridors with her enhanced senses alert to every shadow, every sound, and every indication of potential threat. The pendant remained hidden beneath her dress, but its presence was a constant source of both power and vulnerability. She could feel its energy flowing through her bloodstream, awakening dormant capabilities while simultaneously making her a beacon for anyone with the ability to detect supernatural activity. As she passed through the residential wing of the palace, she became aware of unusual movement in areas that should have been empty at this hour. Her enhanced perception allowed her to identify at least 3 individuals who were moving through the palace with practiced stealth, avoiding the standard patrol routes, and utilizing knowledge of the building's layout that could only have been acquired through extensive reconnaissance or inside assistance. Rather than retreat to her rooms and attempt to hide from this threat, Evangeline made a decision that would have been impossible without the pendant's influence. She began to stalk the intruders, using her new abilities to remain undetected while gathering information about their numbers, capabilities, and objectives. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears about the Order's penetration of palace security. The 3 individuals were not common thieves or even ordinary assassins. They moved with supernatural grace and precision that indicated advanced training and abilities similar to her own. Their thoughts were heavily shielded, but she could sense enough of their intentions to understand that they were conducting reconnaissance for a larger operation planned to coincide with the following evening's state dinner. More disturbing was the realization that they had been in the palace for weeks, possibly months, gradually mapping its defenses and identifying the most vulnerable approaches to the royal family. The activation of the Moonstone Pendant had not attracted their attention. It had simply accelerated a timeline that had already been established. Using abilities she was still learning to control, Evangeline began to probe the mental shields that protected the intruder's thoughts. The process was exhausting and dangerous, requiring her to extend her consciousness in ways that left her physically vulnerable. But the information she gained was crucial to understanding the scope of the threat facing her family and kingdom. The intruders were advanced scouts for a much larger force that was positioning itself around the palace grounds in preparation for tomorrow's ceremonies. The Order planned to use the state dinner as an opportunity to eliminate not just Evangeline and her father, but also several other European royals who would be attending as guests and who were suspected of possessing similar supernatural abilities. The scale of the planned operation was breathtaking in its audacity. The Order intended to stage what would appear to be a terrorist attack, eliminating multiple royal bloodlines in a single operation while positioning themselves to assume control of the resulting power vacuum. The event would destabilize European politics and create opportunities for Order members to assume positions of influence throughout the affected kingdoms. As dawn began to break over the palace grounds, Evangeline realized that she faced an impossible choice. She could attempt to warn her father and the palace security forces, but doing so would require her to reveal that she had accessed the pendant against his direct orders. The resulting conflict would weaken their ability to respond to the immediate threat while potentially destroying the trust between them that was crucial to their family survival. Alternatively, she could attempt to use her newly awakened abilities to counter the Order's plans directly, but her lack of training and experience made such an approach extremely dangerous. The pendant provided power and knowledge, but it could not instantly transform her into the kind of supernatural warrior that her grandmother had become through years of careful development and practice. The decision was made for her when she detected the approach of additional Order agents moving through the palace grounds with equipment that suggested they intended to begin their assault several hours earlier than originally planned. The activation of the Moonstone pendant had convinced them that their presence had been detected, forcing them to abandon their careful timetable in favor of immediate action. Evangeline retreated to her private chambers and used the secure communication system that connected her directly to her father's study. The encryption protocols that protected royal communications would prevent the Order agents from intercepting her message, but she knew that time was running out rapidly. "Father," she whispered into the concealed microphone, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions and sensations flowing through her enhanced consciousness. "We need to meet immediately. The palace is compromised, and the threats you warned me about are already inside our walls. I've learned things that change everything about our situation, and we have very little time to respond appropriately." The response came back within seconds, her father's voice carrying a note of resignation that suggested he had been expecting this moment despite his efforts to prevent it. "The royal study, immediately. Bring whatever you've discovered, and prepare yourself for revelations that will make yesterday's conversation seem simple by comparison." As Evangeline prepared to leave her chambers, she caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror that had been a fixture of her room since childhood. The young woman looking back at her bore the same features she had seen every day for 23 years, but there was something fundamentally different about her eyes. They now held depths that seemed to contain centuries of knowledge and responsibility, and when a light hit the hidden pendant beneath her dress, they seemed to glow with their own inner fire. The transformation that had begun when she first touched the Moonstone pendant was irreversible. She was no longer merely Princess Evangeline of Aldermore, heir to a conventional throne and conventional responsibilities. She had become the inheritor of an ancient legacy, the wielder of supernatural abilities that came with obligations that extended far beyond the borders of any single kingdom. But with that transformation came a clarity of purpose that she had never experienced before. The visions granted by the pendant had shown her possible futures, and she was determined to ensure that the path her kingdom followed would be one of strength, justice, and protection for all those who could not defend themselves against the supernatural forces that sought to control and exploit them. The war between the Order of the Crimson Dawn and those who opposed them was about to enter a new phase, and Evangeline understood that her choices in the next few hours would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone she had sworn to protect. King Marcus stood in the royal study, surrounded by maps, documents, and electronic displays that transformed the elegant chamber into a war room worthy of any military command center. His face bore the weight of sleepless hours and impossible decisions, while his eyes held a combination of pride and terror as he watched his daughter process the full scope of the crisis that had engulfed their kingdom. Lord Chancellor Blackwood occupied the chair opposite the king's desk. His usually impeccable appearance, disheveled by a night, spent coordinating emergency responses to intelligence reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of their situation. At 62, Blackwood was a master of espionage and counterintelligence who had served the crown for over 3 decades. But even his extensive experience had not prepared him for the supernatural dimensions of the threat they now faced. "The satellite surveillance confirms our worst fears," Blackwood reported, his voice hoarse from hours of nonstop briefings and coordination calls. Order forces have been positioning themselves around the palace grounds for at least 48 hours. They have at least 30 operatives in place, including several individuals whose psychological profiles suggest they possess supernatural abilities similar to those described in the historical records. Evangeline stood before the massive window that overlooked the palace gardens, the moonstone pendant now visible around her neck as it pulsed with gentle light that seemed to respond to her emotional state. The enhanced awareness granted by the pendant allowed her to sense the presence of hostile forces throughout the grounds, their malevolent intentions creating dark spots in her perception that stood out like shadows against the natural beauty of the landscape. "They're not just positioning for an attack," she said, her voice carrying new depths of authority and knowledge that made both men take note. "I can sense their true intentions through the pendant's connection to the supernatural realm. They plan to capture rather than kill, at least initially. The Order wants to study our bloodline's abilities before deciding how best to utilize or eliminate them." Marcus moved to stand beside his daughter, his expression mixing paternal concern with royal resolve. "Then, we have advantages they don't expect. Your grandmother spent years developing countermeasures against Order tactics, strategies that I've maintained and updated even though I hoped never to use them. The question is whether you're prepared to embrace abilities that you've only just discovered." The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from the secure communication system that connected the palace to intelligence networks throughout Europe. Blackwood activated the display, revealing encrypted video feed from a location that appeared to be a medieval castle somewhere in the mountainous regions of Central Europe. The woman who appeared on the screen possessed an ageless beauty that made it difficult to determine whether she was 30 or 60 years old. Her silver hair was braided with ribbons that seemed to shimmer with their own light, and her violet eyes held depths of knowledge that reminded Evangeline powerfully of the visions she had experienced while first touching the pendant. "Your Majesty," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested origins in multiple countries rather than any single nationality. "I am Lady Celeste Blackthorn of the Northwind Covenant. Your daughter's activation of the Moonstone Pendant has sent ripples through the supernatural networks of Europe, and those of us who opposed the Order during your mother's reign are prepared to offer assistance once again." Marcus stepped forward, his expression showing recognition mixed with emotions that Evangeline couldn't quite identify. "Lady Blackthorn, it has been many years since we last communicated. I had hoped that this day would never come, as did we all, Your Majesty. But the Order has grown stronger during the years of peace, and their infiltration of conventional power structures has reached levels that threaten the balance between the supernatural and natural worlds. Your daughter's awakening comes at a crucial moment when leadership is desperately needed." Evangeline approached the screen, studying the woman whose presence seemed to radiate competence and ancient wisdom. "Lady Blackthorn, the pendant has shown me visions of a resistance network that my grandmother helped establish. Are you part of that network?" "I am one of its founding members, Your Highness. The Northwind Covenant represents 7 royal houses from across Europe who possess bloodline abilities similar to your own. We have spent 25 years preparing for the Order's next major offensive, and your activation of the pendant signals that their plans are now in motion." The woman's image was joined by several other figures, each appearing to transmit from different locations, but all sharing the indefinable aura of supernatural power that Evangeline was learning to recognize. She saw a man with the bearing of a military commander speaking from what appeared to be a fortress in Scotland, a young woman surrounded by ancient books in a library that could have belonged to any of a dozen European universities, and an elderly gentleman whose formal attire and surroundings suggested a connection to one of the great banking houses of Switzerland. The Order's operation against Ravencrest Palace is part of a coordinated assault on supernatural bloodlines throughout Europe, the Scottish commander reported, his accent thick with Highland authority. "Similar forces are moving against our allies in France, Germany, and the Netherlands. They plan to eliminate organized resistance in a single decisive campaign." Evangeline felt the pendant's energy surging in response to her emotional reaction to this intelligence. The implications were staggering. The Order wasn't just targeting her family, but attempting to destroy every center of supernatural resistance in Europe. The peace that had protected their world for decades was ending not gradually, but in a sudden explosion of coordinated violence. "What kind of assistance can you provide?" Marcus asked, his royal training allowing him to focus on practical considerations despite the overwhelming nature of the threat they faced. "We can offer intelligence, strategic coordination, and direct supernatural support," Lady Blackthorn replied. "But the most important assistance we can provide is training for your daughter. The pendant amplifies natural abilities, but without proper instruction, those abilities can be as dangerous to the wielder as they are to her enemies." The Swiss banker leaned forward in his transmission, his expression grave. "The Order has spent decades developing techniques to corrupt and control individuals with supernatural abilities. They have drugs that enhance psychic sensitivity while destroying mental resistance, rituals that can bind supernatural powers to their will, and technologies that can track and neutralize bloodline abilities. Your daughter needs preparation for threats that go far beyond conventional warfare." Evangeline studied the faces on the screen, recognizing allies, but also understanding the enormous responsibility that was being placed on her shoulders. These people had maintained their resistance for 25 years while waiting for leadership to emerge from the Ravencrest bloodline. Her decision to claim the pendant hadn't just awakened her own abilities. It had reactivated an entire shadow network that would now look to her for guidance in the conflict to come. "How long do we have before the Order's assault begins?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions and sensations flowing through her enhanced consciousness. "Our intelligence suggests they plan to move during tonight's state dinner," the young woman from the university library reported. "They've arranged for several Order members to attend as part of foreign delegations, while their assault teams will strike from multiple directions during the ceremony. The plan is to make it appear as though international terrorists attacked, while the royal families of Europe were gathered together." Blackwood activated additional displays that showed the layout of the palace and surrounding grounds, with red indicators marking the positions of known Order operatives. "We've identified at least 45 hostile individuals within a 5-mile radius of the palace. Our conventional security forces are well-trained and well-equipped, but they're not prepared for opponents who possess supernatural abilities." Marcus studied the tactical displays with the eye of a ruler who had spent decades preparing for threats both conventional and extraordinary. "We have advantages they don't expect. The palace contains defensive systems that my mother installed during her reign, protections that are key to the Ravencrest bloodline and activated by the Moonstone Pendant. But using them will require Evangeline to fully embrace abilities she's only just discovered." The pendant pulsed against Evangeline's chest as she processed the weight of responsibility being placed upon her. Through its enhanced awareness, she could sense the approaching storm of conflict like a weather system moving across the landscape of possibility. The choices she made in the next few hours would determine not just her own survival, but the fate of everyone who had spent decades preparing for this moment. "I need to understand exactly what I'm capable of," she said, addressing Lady Blackthorn directly. "The visions showed me possibilities, but I need practical knowledge if I'm going to lead effectively in the battle ahead." Lady Blackthorn's image shifted as she consulted displays that were invisible to the palace's cameras. The Ravencrest bloodline carries 3 primary supernatural gifts that manifest differently in each generation. You should possess enhanced psychic sensitivity that allows you to read intentions and detect deception, the ability to manipulate probability and influence outcomes through focused will, and most importantly, the power to coordinate and amplify the abilities of others with similar gifts. The Scottish commander nodded grimly. "That last ability is why the Order has worked so hard to eliminate your bloodline. A Ravencrest monarch who fully develops their coordination abilities can transform scattered resistance into an organized supernatural army. Your grandmother was developing such capabilities when they killed her." Evangeline walked to the center of the study, closing her eyes and allowing the pendant's energy to flow freely through her consciousness. The enhanced awareness expanded beyond the palace walls, reaching out to touch the minds and abilities of the allies who were waiting for her leadership. She could sense their individual strengths, their unique supernatural gifts, and the potential for combining their powers in ways that would be exponentially more effective than individual action. But she could also sense the approaching Order forces with new clarity and precision. Their hostile intentions burned like dark fires in her supernatural perception, and she could detect the unnatural enhancements that had been used to augment their natural abilities. Some had been chemically altered to suppress their conscience and enhance their aggression. Others carried supernatural artifacts that shielded them from psychic detection while amplifying their own dark powers. Most disturbing was the presence of what the pendant identified as corrupted bloodline descendants. Individuals from once noble supernatural families who had been turned to the Order's service through a combination of coercion, bribery, and supernatural manipulation. These individuals possessed abilities similar to her own, but their powers had been twisted into weapons of oppression rather than tools of protection and justice. They have at least 8 corrupted descendants among their forces, she reported, opening her eyes to find both her father and Lord Blackwood watching her with expressions of amazed concern. The Order has been systematically recruiting and corrupting members of other supernatural bloodlines for decades. We're not just facing ordinary operatives, we're facing people whose abilities match or potentially exceed our own. The implications of this intelligence sent a chill through everyone present. The Order's campaign wasn't just about eliminating resistance. It was about building an army of supernatural operatives who could dominate both the natural and supernatural worlds without effective opposition. Then, we need to accelerate our timeline, Marcus decided, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. Cancel the state dinner. Evacuate the palace of non-essential personnel. Activate all defensive systems and prepare for siege conditions. No, Evangeline said firmly, her voice carrying new depths of authority that surprised everyone present, including herself. Canceling the dinner would only force them to adapt their plans while maintaining the initiative. Instead, we use their own strategy against them. We let the dinner proceed, but we turn it into a trap. Lady Blackthorn's image leaned forward with obvious interest. Explain, Your Highness. Evangeline moved to the tactical displays, her enhanced perception allowing her to visualize possibilities and probabilities in ways that conventional strategic planning could never achieve. The Order expects us to react defensively, to try to protect ourselves by avoiding confrontation. But they've committed significant resources to this operation, including bringing their corrupted bloodline operatives into close proximity with our allies. If we can coordinate properly, we can turn their assault into an opportunity to eliminate a substantial portion of their European leadership. The Scottish commander's expression showed both admiration and concern. A bold strategy, Your Highness, but extremely dangerous. You're proposing to use yourself and your father as bait in a trap that could eliminate both the Order's operatives and the Resistance leadership if it fails. The pendant is showing me probability streams, Evangeline explained, her consciousness still partially merged with the artifact's supernatural awareness. I can see multiple possible outcomes, and the scenarios where we take aggressive action have significantly higher success rates than those where we attempt purely defensive strategies. Marcus studied his daughter's face, recognizing the transformation that had taken place since she first touched the pendant. The young woman who had questioned palace traditions was evolving into something far more powerful, a supernatural leader whose abilities might be the key to ending the Order's influence once and for all. What do you need from us? He asked, his voice carrying both royal authority and paternal trust. Evangeline turned back to the screens displaying their allies across Europe, her presence seeming to energize the supernatural network that connected them all. Coordinate your forces to arrive at the palace by early evening, using whatever transportation methods will avoid Order detection. We're going to turn tonight's state dinner into a gathering that our enemies will never forget. As the various alliance leaders began coordinating the movement of their forces toward Ravencrest Palace, Evangeline felt the weight of leadership settling around her like a mantle of both power and responsibility. The visions granted by the pendant had shown her glimpses of possible futures, and she was determined to ensure that the path forward would lead to victory rather than destruction for everyone who had placed their trust in her bloodline's legacy. The storm was gathering with supernatural intensity, but for the first time since discovering the truth about her heritage, Evangeline felt ready to face whatever challenges the Order could bring against her family and kingdom. The grand ballroom of Ravencrest Palace had been transformed into a battlefield disguised as an elegant diplomatic gathering. Crystal chandeliers cast sparkling light over formally dressed dignitaries from across Europe, while hidden within the ornate decorations were supernatural protections and modern security systems that would have impressed military strategists from any era. The state dinner was proceeding exactly as planned, but beneath the surface of diplomatic pleasantries, two ancient forces were preparing for a confrontation that would determine the future of supernatural power in the modern world. Evangeline moved through the assembled guests with the grace expected of a princess, but her enhanced senses were cataloging threats and allies with precision that would have been impossible just 24 hours earlier. The moonstone pendant remained hidden beneath her formal gown, but its energy flowed through her consciousness like liquid starlight, connecting her to supernatural networks that span the continent and revealing layers of reality that most people could never perceive. Among the 150 guests were representatives from 12 European royal families, 7 of whom carried supernatural bloodlines that had been secretly allied with the Ravencrest resistance for decades. But scattered throughout the crowd were also Order operatives posing as diplomats, security personnel, and even journalists, their hostile intentions burning like dark flames in her expanded awareness. The centerpiece of the evening's diplomatic agenda was a series of trade negotiations between Aldermore and the neighboring Kingdom of Valeria, but the real focus of attention was on the presence of Prince Alessandro of Montavia, whose family had been suspected of Order sympathies for generations. His appearance at the dinner represented either a genuine attempt at reconciliation or a sophisticated infiltration that could compromise every resistance ally present. King Marcus commanded the head table with a dignity befitting his station, but Evangeline could sense the supernatural energy radiating from his position as he coordinated defensive preparations through psychic channels that the Order could not detect. Her father's abilities had always been more subtle than her grandmother's, focusing on strategic coordination rather than direct supernatural intervention. But tonight those skills would be crucial to their survival. Lord Chancellor Blackwood moved between groups of guests with the practiced ease of a career diplomat, but his real attention was focused on monitoring communication channels that connected the palace to resistance forces positioned throughout Europe. The intelligence network that had remained dormant for 25 years was now fully active, providing real-time updates on Order movements and countermeasures that would have been impossible without supernatural coordination. As the evening progressed through multiple courses of exquisite cuisine and carefully orchestrated diplomatic conversations, Evangeline became increasingly aware of the supernatural tension building throughout the ballroom. The Order operatives were following their predetermined timeline, positioning themselves for maximum effect when they received the signal to begin their assault. But they were also becoming aware that something was different about this gathering, that they were facing opposition far more coordinated and powerful than their intelligence had suggested. The first indication of approaching crisis came through the pendant's connection to Lady Blackthorn, whose forces had been monitoring Order communications from a concealed position in the forest surrounding the palace grounds. The mental communication that flowed between them carried urgency and determination in equal measure. Your Highness, Order assault teams are beginning their final approach. We count at least 60 operatives moving toward predetermined positions around the palace perimeter. The corrupted bloodline descendants are taking positions that suggest they plan to create supernatural barriers that would prevent escape or outside assistance. Evangeline maintained her composed, diplomatic demeanor while responding through the psychic channels that the pendant made possible. Understood. Are our allies in position? The Scottish Highland Guard arrived 20 minutes ago and has taken concealed positions in the palace gardens. The Swiss Banking Consortium's security specialists have integrated with your conventional forces. The French resistance cell is standing by to provide supernatural countermeasures when the assault begins. The coordination of these preparations represented the culmination of decades of careful planning by Queen Isabella and her allies. The palace itself had been designed to serve as a fortress against supernatural attack, with hidden passages, reinforced safe rooms, and energy conduits that could channel and amplify bloodline abilities. But those defenses required active control by a Ravencrest descendant wearing the Moonstone pendant to reach their full potential. As the dinner service concluded and guests began moving toward the ballroom for the evening's ceremonial presentations, Evangeline felt the pendant's energy surging in response to approaching danger. Through its enhanced awareness, she could sense Order operatives moving into final position while their corrupted bloodline descendants began weaving supernatural barriers designed to isolate the palace from outside assistance. The attack began not with violence, but with subtlety that demonstrated the Order's sophisticated understanding of modern diplomatic protocols. Prince Alessandro of Montevia rose from his seat and requested permission to address the gathering, his words carrying undertones of supernatural compulsion that were designed to make his audience more receptive to suggestion and less likely to notice suspicious activity. Honored guests, fellow royalty, distinguished representatives of our great European traditions, he began, his voice carrying artificial warmth that disguised darker intentions. Tonight we gather not merely to celebrate diplomatic friendship, but to discuss the future of leadership in our rapidly changing world. Evangeline recognized the speech as a prearranged signal for Order operatives to begin their infiltration of the ballroom security perimeter. Through the pendant's supernatural awareness, she could sense hostile forces moving through hidden passages and service corridors that should have been impenetrable to unauthorized personnel. The Order's intelligence gathering had been far more thorough than even their most pessimistic estimates had suggested. Rather than wait for the Order to complete their positioning, Evangeline made a decision that would transform the evening from a defensive battle into an aggressive counterattack. She rose from her own seat, the Moonstone pendant suddenly becoming visible as she allowed its concealment to drop, and addressed the gathering with authority that commanded immediate attention from everyone present. Prince Alessandro speaks truly about discussing the future of leadership, she declared, her voice carrying supernatural harmonics that made it impossible to ignore or dismiss. But perhaps he would be interested to know that some among us tonight represent forces that have sought to control and corrupt that leadership for centuries. The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. Order operatives throughout the ballroom froze in shocked recognition that their infiltration had been detected, while resistance allies moved smoothly into predetermined positions that had been coordinated through supernatural communication channels. The careful choreography of diplomatic interaction was replaced by the deadly dance of supernatural warfare. Prince Alessandro's composed demeanor cracked as he realized that the trap he had helped orchestrate had become a trap for his own forces. His hand moved toward a concealed device that would signal the beginning of the Order's assault, but before he could complete the motion, Lady Blackthorn materialized from what appeared to be empty air, her own supernatural abilities allowing her to transport directly into the ballroom despite the Order's supposed barriers. Prince Alessandro of Montevia, Lady Blackthorn announced, her voice carrying the authority of ancient nobility mixed with supernatural power, by the authority of the Northwind Covenant, and, in the name of the European Supernatural Alliance, you are charged with treason against the bloodline families and conspiracy with corrupted forces that threaten the balance between worlds. The formal accusations triggered a chain reaction throughout the ballroom as concealed Order operatives revealed themselves while resistance allies dropped their own diplomatic disguises. What had moments before been an elegant state dinner became a supernatural battlefield, where abilities that most of the modern world considered mythical were deployed with deadly precision and strategic coordination. Evangeline felt the pendant's power flowing through her consciousness as she assumed direct control of the palace's defensive systems. Ancient protections built into the very foundations of the building awakened at her command, creating barriers of crystallized energy that separated hostile forces from innocent guests while providing cover for resistance fighters who were engaging order operatives throughout the building. The corrupted bloodline descendants proved to be formidable opponents, their abilities enhanced by decades of order training and supernatural artifacts that amplified their natural gifts while suppressing any remaining conscience or moral restraint. But they had not anticipated facing coordinated resistance from multiple allied bloodlines, working in perfect synchronization under Evangeline's leadership. King Marcus revealed capabilities that he had hidden even from his closest advisors, coordinating palace security forces with supernatural precision while simultaneously maintaining protective barriers around non-combatant guests. His abilities complemented those of his daughter perfectly, creating a defensive network that proved impenetrable to order assault teams attempting to penetrate the ballroom from multiple directions. The battle raged through multiple levels of reality simultaneously. On the physical plane, conventional security forces engaged order operatives in firefights that echoed through the palace corridors. On the psychic plane, bloodline descendants dueled with mental energies that could shatter minds or heal devastating injuries. On the supernatural plane, ancient powers clashed with modern corruptions in a conflict that would determine whether the future belonged to those who sought to protect and preserve or those who sought to control and dominate. As the night progressed, it became clear that the Order had underestimated both the strength of the resistance and the power of the awakened Raven Crest bloodline. Their carefully planned assault was being systematically dismantled by opponents who possessed not just superior abilities, but superior coordination and strategic vision. The turning point came when Evangeline used the pendant's power to establish direct psychic contact with corrupted bloodline descendants, offering them a chance to break free from the Order's influence rather than continuing to serve as weapons against their own heritage. The process was exhausting and dangerous, requiring her to extend her consciousness into minds that had been twisted by decades of manipulation. But the results were extraordinary. One by one, corrupted descendants began to remember their true heritage and reject the artificial loyalties that had been imposed upon them. The Order's supernatural advantage crumbled as their most powerful operatives turned against them, while Evangeline's growing network of redeemed allies provided intelligence and capabilities that made resistance victory inevitable. Prince Alessandro made a final desperate attempt to escape, activating supernatural artifacts that opened portals to Order strongholds throughout Europe. But Lady Blackthorn and the Scottish Highland Commander were ready for such tactics, using their own abilities to trap the fleeing prince within dimensional barriers that prevented any retreat or reinforcement. As dawn broke over Ravencrest Palace, the immediate crisis had been resolved, but Evangeline understood that the knight's victory represented only the beginning of a much larger campaign. The Order's European network had been severely damaged, but their global influence remained intact, and they would undoubtedly adapt their strategies in response to this defeat. Standing in the grand ballroom, surrounded by allies from across Europe, Evangeline felt the weight of her true inheritance settling around her like a crown that was both empowering and humbling. The Moonstone pendant had awakened abilities she was still learning to control, but it had also connected her to a community of individuals who shared her commitment to protecting the innocent and preserving the balance between supernatural and natural worlds. King Marcus approached his daughter as the last of the Order prisoners were being secured by resistance forces, his expression showing pride mixed with concern for the challenges that lay ahead. "You have proven yourself worthy of a legacy Queen Isabella left behind," he said, his voice carrying both royal authority and paternal affection. "But this victory will only make the Order more determined to destroy everything we have built." Evangeline nodded, her enhanced awareness allowing her to sense the broader implications of their success. Then, we use the time we've gained to strengthen our alliances and prepare for the larger conflict ahead. The Order has shown us their capabilities tonight, but they've also revealed their weaknesses. With proper coordination and strategic planning, we can build a resistance network that will protect supernatural bloodlines for generations to come. Lady Blackthorn joined them, her ageless features showing satisfaction tempered by realistic assessment of future challenges. The European alliance is stronger today than it has been in over 2 centuries, Your Highness. With the Ravencrest bloodline providing leadership and the Pendant serving as a coordination focus, we have the foundation for a resistance that could ultimately eliminate the Order's influence entirely. As the sun rose fully above the palace grounds, illuminating gardens where hidden battles have been fought and won, Evangeline understood that her life as a conventional princess was over forever. She had become something far more significant, a leader in a shadow war that would determine whether the future belonged to those who sought to protect and preserve the balance between worlds, or those who sought to control and exploit supernatural power for their own ends. The moonstone pendant pulsed against her chest with rhythms that matched her heartbeat and her determination, connecting her to allies across Europe while serving as a beacon of hope for all those who possess supernatural abilities but lacked the strength to defend themselves alone. The crown she would eventually inherit would be more than just a symbol of royal authority. It would be a sign that the age of hiding and fear was ending, replaced by an era of coordination and purpose that would reshape the hidden history of the world. The Order of the Crimson Dawn had sought to eliminate the Ravencrest bloodline and consolidate their control over European supernatural networks. Instead, they had awakened a force that would ultimately prove to be their destruction. Led by a princess who had transformed from questioning tradition into embracing a destiny that would protect countless innocent people from forces they could never fight alone. As Evangeline looked out over the kingdom that would someday be hers to rule, she saw not just the conventional political entity that appeared on maps, but the supernatural foundation that lay beneath all legitimate authority, the responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves, to preserve the balance that allowed both ordinary and extraordinary people to thrive, and to ensure that power was always used in service of justice rather than domination. The pendant had shown her visions of possible futures, and she was determined to ensure that the path forward would lead to a world where supernatural abilities were recognized as gifts to be treasured rather than weapons to be feared, where bloodline families worked together to preserve peace rather than competing for control, and where the ancient wisdom of her grandmother's legacy would guide humanity toward a future bright with possibility rather than dark with oppression.